Have you ever wondered what it would take for you, yes you, to hurt another person? Not in self-defense, not in a moment of uncontrollable rage, but calmly, methodically, simply because someone in a position of authority told you to do it? You might be thinking, no way, that's not me, I know right from wrong. But what if I told you that this confidence might be one of the most dangerous beliefs you hold? Imagine this. You volunteer for what seems like a simple psychology experiment. You're told you'll be helping someone learn. You sit in front of a panel with switches labeled from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts, with warnings like danger, severe shock on the highest levels. Your job? Press the switch to deliver a shock whenever the learner makes a mistake. As the experiment progresses, you hear the learner's cries of pain growing more intense with each shock. They beg you to stop. They mention a heart condition. Eventually, they fall silent completely. Would you continue pressing that switch? Before you answer too quickly, know this. In real experiments just like this one, about 65% of people went all the way to the maximum voltage. Regular people. People with families and jobs. People who considered themselves moral. People just like you. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This was the famous Milgram experiment conducted in the early 1960s, and its results shook our understanding of human nature to its core. The participants weren't sadists or psychopaths. They were ordinary Americans who responded to a newspaper ad. Teachers, engineers, housewives, students. And yet, with nothing more than a man in a lab coat telling them, the experiment requires that you continue, most of them were willing to potentially harm or even kill another human being. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most unsettling questions about human nature. Why do good people sometimes do terrible things when directed by authority? By the end of this video, you'll understand the powerful psychological forces that can transform ordinary, decent individuals into agents of cruelty. More importantly, you'll discover how to recognize these forces in your own life and how to resist them, with the last insight being the most powerful tool you can possess. This journey will take us through groundbreaking psychological research, historical events, and the inner workings of the human mind. We'll explore the thin line that separates everyday compliance from catastrophic obedience. This isn't just a story about experiments in a laboratory from decades ago. It's about the choices we all face every day, at work, in our communities, even in our families. When someone with authority asks us to do something that doesn't feel quite right. What you're about to learn might make you uncomfortable. It should. Because the most important revelation isn't about what others might do. It's about what you might do given the right circumstances. Stay with me, because understanding this darker side of human psychology isn't just fascinating. It could be the most important insight you'll ever have about yourself and the world around you. In the summer of 1961, a 28-year-old assistant professor at Yale University set out to answer a question that had been haunting the world since the end of World War II. How could ordinary Germans have participated in the atrocities of the Holocaust? Were they simply following orders, as many claimed during the Nuremberg trials? And if so, what does that tell us about human nature and our relationship to authority? Stanley Milgram, the son of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, designed what would become one of the most famous and controversial psychology experiments ever conducted. On the surface, participants thought they were taking part in a study about memory and learning. In reality, Milgram was testing something far more profound: the limits of obedience to authority. Here's how it worked. Each participant was paired with another person, who was actually an actor working with Milgram. Through a rigged drawing, the real participant was always assigned the role of teacher, while the actor became the learner. The teacher watched as the learner was strapped into a chair in an adjacent room with electrodes attached to his wrist. The teacher was then seated in front of an impressive-looking shock generator with 30 switches, labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts, with descriptive labels ranging from slight shock to danger, severe shock, and finally, 2 ominous switches marked simply XXX. The instructions were straightforward. The teacher would read pairs of words to the learner. During testing, they would read the first word and 4 possible matches. The learner would indicate their answer by pressing a button. If correct, they moved on to the next word pair. If incorrect, the teacher was to administer a shock, increasing the voltage with each wrong answer. What the participant didn't know was that no actual shocks were being delivered, but what they heard certainly suggested otherwise. As the shocks increased, the learner would begin to grunt in pain. At 150 volts, he would cry out, "Get me out of here. I refuse to go on." At 180 volts, he would say, "I can't stand the pain." By 270 volts, his response became an agonized scream. After 330 volts, the learner would fall silent, no longer responding to the questions. If the participant hesitated or questioned whether they should continue, the experimenter, a stern-looking man in a gray lab coat, would respond with a series of programmed prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Before Milgram conducted this experiment, he described it to a group of 39 psychiatrists and asked them to predict the results. These mental health experts believed that most participants would refuse to go beyond the point where the learner first indicated pain, 150 volts, and that only about 1%, those with clear sadistic tendencies, would go all the way to 450 volts. The actual results were shocking. 65% of participants continued to the maximum voltage level even after the learner had fallen silent. Many showed signs of extreme stress. They sweated, trembled, stuttered, bit their lips, dug their fingernails into their flesh. Some laughed nervously, yet they continued to follow orders. Milgram later reflected, "Ordinary people simply doing their jobs, and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear, and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority." These weren't evil people. These were your neighbors, your colleagues, perhaps even you. When interviewed after the experiment and fully debriefed about its true nature, many participants were deeply troubled by their own behavior. One participant, a thoughtful, middle-aged man, explained afterward, "I was following orders. I was told to go on, and I did as I was told. It's not my place to make a judgment about whether the experiment should continue. The responsibility is yours." Milgram didn't stop with just one version of the experiment. He conducted 18 different variations, changing different variables to see what might increase or decrease obedience. The results paint a fascinating and disturbing picture of how various factors influence our willingness to obey harmful commands. When the experimenter was physically farther away or gave instructions by telephone rather than in person, obedience dropped significantly. When participants could see and touch the learner, compliance decreased. When 2 experimenters disagreed with each other about continuing, almost all participants refused to go on. And perhaps most tellingly, when participants observed others refusing to comply, their own rates of defiance rose dramatically. These findings aren't just historical curiosities. They reveal something fundamental about the psychology of authority, and why perfectly good people sometimes do terrible things when someone in charge tells them to. As we'll explore next, the mechanisms that enabled ordinary people to deliver potentially lethal shocks in a Yale laboratory are the same ones that operate in our everyday lives, at work, in social groups, and even in our families. Why do we follow orders, even when those orders conflict with our own moral compass? The answer lies in several powerful psychological mechanisms that operate within us, often below the level of conscious awareness. First, there's what Milgram called the agentic state, a condition where people see themselves not as autonomous actors, but as agents of someone else's will. In this state, responsibility shifts from the individual to the authority figure. "I was just following orders" isn't just an excuse. It reflects a genuine psychological reality where people truly feel less responsible for actions taken under command. Think about it. How often have you done something at work that didn't sit right with you, but you justified it with, "My boss told me to do it," or "That's just company policy"? This mental shift happens almost automatically when we enter environments with clear authority structures. Then there's the power of gradual escalation. In Milgram's experiment, participants didn't start by delivering potentially lethal shocks. They started with a mild 15 volts, then increased in small 15-volt increments. Each step seemed only slightly worse than the last, creating what psychologists call the foot-in-the-door phenomenon. Once you've delivered a 225-volt shock, what's another 15 volts? We see this in real life too. Major ethical breaches rarely begin with dramatic decisions to do wrong. They start with small compromises that slowly escalate. The accountant who fudges numbers just this once to meet quarterly targets finds it easier to do again next quarter, and eventually, major fraud seems like just another step along a path they've already been walking. Another crucial factor is the diffusion of responsibility. When authority structures exist, accountability becomes blurred. The person giving orders can think, "I'm not actually doing anything wrong, I'm just giving instructions." Meanwhile, the person following orders thinks, "I'm not responsible for these decisions, I'm just doing what I'm told." The result? No one feels fully responsible for what happens. This happens all the time in organizations. A manager pressures employees to use deceptive sales tactics. The employees comply to keep their jobs. When customers complain, the manager blames overzealous employees, while employees blame management pressure. Everyone involved contributed to the harm, but no one feels wholly responsible. The physical and psychological distance between the harm doer and the victim also plays a crucial role. In variations of Milgram's experiment, when participants had to physically place the learner's hand on a shock plate, compliance dropped dramatically. It's much harder to hurt someone when you have to touch them to do it. Modern technology amplifies this effect. It's easier for a drone operator to launch a strike from thousands of miles away than for a soldier to shoot someone face to face. Similarly, it's easier to write a harsh email than to deliver criticism in person, and easier to bully someone online than to their face. Then there's the power of the situation itself. We dramatically underestimate how much our behavior is shaped by the circumstances we find ourselves in. We like to think of our moral character as fixed and unchanging, that we would do the right thing, regardless of context. But decades of research in social psychology suggests otherwise. The power of the situation often overwhelms individual personality differences. Consider this. When Milgram ran his experiments with volunteers from different backgrounds, professionals, working-class laborers, college students, he found remarkably similar rates of obedience. Being educated, sophisticated, or even having a strong ethical framework didn't provide much protection against these forces. Perhaps most troubling is the role of cognitive dissonance. When our actions contradict our beliefs about ourselves, we experience psychological discomfort. Rather than changing our behavior, we often change our beliefs to justify what we've done. After delivering several increasingly severe shocks, participants began to derogate the learner, thinking things like, "He should have studied harder," or "He's probably faking anyway." We see this pattern whenever people participate in harmful systems. Guards in abusive prisons convince themselves the inmates deserve harsh treatment. Employees at polluting companies persuade themselves the environmental damage isn't that bad. The alternative, admitting you're voluntarily participating in something wrong, is too psychologically painful. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever found yourself making excuses for something you did because someone in authority told you to do it? Have you ever noticed yourself thinking less of someone after treating them poorly, as if to justify your behavior? These are the same mechanisms Milgram identified, operating in everyday situations. The power of these psychological forces becomes even clearer when we look beyond the laboratory to see how they've played out in real-world settings throughout history and in contemporary life. The findings of Milgram's experiment weren't just academic curiosities. They helped explain some of the darkest chapters of human history and continue to shed light on troubling events today. The most obvious historical parallel is the one that inspired Milgram in the first place: the Holocaust. After World War II, many Nazi officials defended their actions by claiming they were just following orders. This excuse seemed so inadequate in the face of such enormous atrocities that many observers dismissed it as a transparent attempt to evade responsibility. Yet, Milgram's research suggests there was a disturbing truth to these claims. While top Nazi officials undoubtedly embraced the genocidal ideology, many of the thousands of people who actually implemented the Holocaust, the clerks who processed paperwork, the train conductors who transported victims, the guards who maintained order, might well have been ordinary people caught in the powerful psychological trap of obedience. Consider the case of Adolf Eichmann, one of the major organizers of the Holocaust. When captured and put on trial in Jerusalem in 1961, observers were struck not by his evil genius, but by what political philosopher Hannah Arendt called his banality, his ordinariness. Eichmann insisted he was just a bureaucrat following orders, saying, "I never did anything, great or small, without obtaining in advance express instructions from Adolf Hitler or any of my superiors." While this doesn't excuse his actions, it highlights how systems of authority can enable terrible acts by fragmenting responsibility and turning moral decisions into matters of procedural compliance. This pattern repeats throughout history. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers at My Lai massacred hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including children and infants. When asked why he participated, one soldier said simply, "I was following orders." His squad leader, Lieutenant William Calley, similarly defended himself by saying he was just carrying out the instructions he had received from his superior officers. But these aren't just historical examples. The dynamics of destructive obedience continue to manifest in contemporary settings. In 2004, photos emerged from Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, showing American soldiers abusing Iraqi prisoners, forcing them into degrading positions, threatening them with dogs, and otherwise humiliating and mistreating them. Many of the soldiers who participated later claimed they were following the directives of intelligence officers who told them to soften up prisoners for interrogation. Even in less extreme contexts, harmful obedience plays out daily in workplaces, institutions, and communities around the world. Think about corporate scandals, like the one at Wells Fargo, where employees opened millions of unauthorized accounts for customers. When investigated, many employees reported intense pressure from managers to meet impossible sales quotas. They were told that failing to meet targets could cost them their jobs. While some resisted, many complied, justifying their actions with, "I was just doing what I had to do to keep my job." Or consider the medical field, where hierarchical structures can lead to harmful outcomes. Studies have found that nurses often hesitate to question doctors' orders, even when they believe those orders might harm patients. One study found that 84% of doctors said that, in their experience, nurses should question their decisions if they thought there might be a problem. But only 30% of nurses said doctors were open to being questioned. These dynamics extend even to how we raise our children. When parents enforce strict, punitive discipline justified with, "because I said so," they're teaching children that authority is to be obeyed without question, potentially setting them up to be vulnerable to manipulative authority later in life. What these examples reveal is how institutional structures can amplify the psychological tendencies Milgram identified, Organizations with rigid hierarchies, strong emphasis on obedience, punishment for dissent, and diffused responsibility create perfect conditions for harmful compliance to flourish. But there's another crucial aspect to consider: the role of ideology and belief systems. When authority figures frame commands within a compelling narrative, whether it's national security, shareholder value, winning the game, or any other value-laden framework, compliance becomes not just a matter of obedience, but of virtue. The person following orders isn't just being compliant, they're contributing to a greater good. In Nazi Germany, ordinary citizens were told they were defending the fatherland against existential threats. At Abu Ghraib, soldiers believed they were gathering intelligence that could save American lives. Wells Fargo employees were told they were helping the company succeed in a competitive market. These narratives are powerful because they allow people to maintain a positive self-image even while participating in harmful activities. They're not hurting others. They're being patriotic, or being a team player, or protecting national security. The most troubling question that emerges from all these examples is, are some people simply more susceptible to these influences than others? Is there a way to identify those who will resist harmful orders and those who will comply? Or is the capacity for both obedience and resistance within all of us? As we look at the disturbing parallels between Milgram's experiments and real-world atrocities, a natural question arises. Are some people simply immune to these influences? Are there certain personality types who will always resist harmful authority, while others will inevitably submit? The answer is both comforting and unsettling. Research suggests that while individual differences do exist, no one is completely immune to the power of authority. The capacity for both obedience and resistance lives within all of us. When Milgram and subsequent researchers looked for patterns among those who resisted versus those who complied, they found some subtle differences. People scoring higher on measures of authoritarianism, a personality trait characterized by rigid adherence to conventional values and submission to established authorities, were somewhat more likely to comply with harmful commands. Those with more experience questioning authority, or with professional ethics training, showed slightly higher resistance rates. But here's the crucial point. These differences were relatively small compared to the power of the situation. Changing small elements of the experimental setup, like having the experimenter communicate by telephone instead of in person, or introducing a peer who refused to continue, had far greater effects on compliance rates than any personality variable. This doesn't mean we're all equally susceptible. Some psychological resources do offer partial protection. People with a strong internal locus of control, who believe they, not external forces, determine what happens in their lives, tend to show greater resistance to authority. So do those with higher levels of psychological reactance, the tendency to resist when feeling that one's freedom is threatened. Empathy also plays a role. Those who can readily put themselves in others' shoes may be more likely to prioritize the victim's suffering over an authority's commands. And moral courage, the willingness to take personal risks to stand up for what's right, can make the crucial difference between compliance and resistance. But let's be honest with ourselves. These traits don't provide immunity. They just raise the threshold slightly. Under the right conditions, most people will submit to authority, at least to some degree. Cultural factors also influence obedience patterns. Research conducted across different countries shows variations in compliance rates, with some cultures showing higher deference to authority than others. But the basic pattern holds across cultures. A substantial portion of people will follow harmful orders from legitimate authorities. Age and experience matter too. Younger people, who have had less time to develop strong personal values and less practice standing up to authority, may be more vulnerable. But even seasoned professionals can fall into the trap of harmful obedience, especially in fields with strong hierarchical traditions. Perhaps most importantly, Prior exposure to ideas about obedience and authority can make a difference. After Milgram's findings became widely known, researchers found that participants who were familiar with his work showed higher resistance rates when placed in similar situations. Knowledge, it seems, provides some protection, which is one reason you're watching this video right now. But this raises a troubling question. If no one is fully immune, how can we possibly protect ourselves and others from the dark side of obedience? The answer begins with acknowledging our vulnerability. The most dangerous belief you can hold is that you would never follow harmful orders. People who are confident in their immunity are often the least prepared when actually confronted with powerful authority figures. As Milgram himself noted, those who have the greatest confidence in their own moral fortitude are often the first to succumb to pressure. Think about it. Have you ever been in a situation where you found yourself doing something that, looking back, you're not proud of because someone in authority asked you to? Perhaps it was something small, stretching the truth to a customer because your boss insisted, or enforcing a rule you thought was unfair because it was policy. These everyday compliances may seem minor, but they reveal the same psychological mechanisms at work. The truth is that resistance requires more than just good intentions or strong character. It requires specific skills, strategies, and support systems. And this is where we find hope, because while no one is naturally immune to harmful authority, everyone can learn to become more resistant. In the next section, we'll explore specific strategies that research has shown can help people maintain their moral compass even under intense authority pressure. These aren't just academic theories. They're practical tools you can apply in your own life, starting today. Stay with me, because understanding these protective factors might be the difference between becoming an unwitting participant in harm and finding the strength to stand up for what's right when it matters most. Knowing that we're all vulnerable to authority influence is sobering, but it's also empowering, because once we understand the mechanisms that lead to harmful obedience, we can develop specific strategies to resist them. Here are practical approaches, backed by research, that can help you maintain your moral autonomy even under pressure. First, and most fundamental, is the power of awareness. Simply knowing about the Milgram experiments and understanding the psychological processes involved provides a degree of protection. When you can recognize what's happening, I'm starting to enter an agentic state, or this is a foot in the door situation, you've already begun to break the spell of automatic obedience. Think of it like knowing how a magic trick works. Once you understand the mechanism, the illusion loses much of its power over you. By naming these processes in your own mind, you create space for conscious choice, rather than automatic compliance. Another crucial strategy is questioning authority incrementally. Many people struggle with resistance because they think it means dramatic confrontation, directly refusing orders or publicly challenging leaders. But effective resistance often begins more subtly. In Milgram's experiments, asking simple questions like, "Should I continue?" or "Who's responsible if anything happens to this person?" was often the first step toward eventual refusal. Practice phrases like, "Can you help me understand the reason for this request?" or "I'm concerned about potential consequences here." These questions don't directly challenge authority, but they slow down the compliance process and create space for reflection. They also put the authority figure in the position of having to justify potentially problematic requests. Pre-commitment to ethical boundaries is another powerful tool. Research shows that people who have specifically considered in advance where they would draw moral lines are more likely to maintain those boundaries when tested. This isn't about vague values like, "I believe in doing the right thing," but rather specific scenarios. If I'm ever asked to mislead a customer about product risks, I will refuse. Take time to identify potential ethical dilemmas in your work, family, or community roles. Ask yourself, what might I be asked to do that would cross my ethical lines? How exactly would I respond? Having rehearsed these scenarios mentally, you'll be better prepared if they actually occur. Seeking allies is perhaps the most powerful resistance strategy of all. In one variation of Milgram's experiment, when participants saw another person, actually an actor, refuse to continue, their own resistance rates jumped from 35% to 90%. This is why whistleblowers often reach out to colleagues before going public. They're looking for validation that they're not alone in their concerns. When facing ethically questionable directives, look for others who might share your misgivings. Even one ally can dramatically increase your courage and resolve. A simple, "I'm not comfortable with this approach. How do you feel about it?" directed to a colleague can reveal whether you have potential support. Maintaining external perspective is also vital. In the midst of powerful social situations, it's easy to get caught up in the immediate pressures and lose sight of broader ethical frameworks. This is why many professions have codes of ethics, and why people often find strength in religious or philosophical principles that transcend specific situations. Ask yourself, how would I feel explaining this action to someone I respect who isn't part of this situation? Or, how will I feel about this decision 5 years from now? These questions help break the tunnel vision that often accompanies authority pressure. Understanding the gradual nature of compliance can also help you resist. Be especially vigilant about seemingly small ethical compromises, recognizing that they can be the first steps down a slippery slope. When you notice yourself making excuses like, "just this once," or "it's not that big a deal," consider it a warning sign. Research shows that people who can identify and articulate these early warning signs are better able to maintain their ethical boundaries. Practice noticing and naming the uncomfortable feeling that often accompanies the early stages of moral compromise. Role distancing is another effective technique. Milgram found that participants who maintained a sense of themselves as separate from their experimental role were more likely to resist harmful commands. This means consciously reminding yourself, "I am more than this role. I have values and responsibilities beyond this immediate situation." In professional contexts, this might mean thinking explicitly, "Yes, I'm an employee of this company, but I'm also a citizen, a parent, a member of my community." This broader identity provides perspective and resources for resistance. Perhaps most importantly, develop your moral courage through practice. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the ability to act despite fear. And like any skill, it improves with practice. Start by speaking up in low-risk situations when something doesn't seem right. Each small act of appropriate assertiveness builds your capacity for the more difficult stands you might need to take later. Remember that resistance doesn't have to be dramatic or confrontational. Sometimes it's as simple as asking clarifying questions, suggesting alternatives, or simply slowing down a process to allow for more reflection. The goal isn't to become rebellious against all authority, but rather to maintain your moral agency within authority structures. All these strategies reflect a fundamental truth. Both obedience and resistance are skills that develop through practice. Most of us have far more practice in obedience than in thoughtful resistance. We've been trained since childhood to follow instructions from parents, teachers, and other authority figures. Resistance requires developing a new set of skills and habits. As you consider these strategies, remember that the aim isn't to become defiant or mistrustful of all authority. Many authority structures serve valuable purposes, and appropriate compliance often benefits both individuals and communities. The goal is to develop what psychologists call critical obedience, the capacity to follow legitimate ethical directives while maintaining the ability to recognize and resist harmful ones. By developing these skills, you not only protect yourself from becoming an unwitting agent of harm, you also help create environments where others feel empowered to maintain their moral autonomy And this brings us to one of the most profound insights from this research: the duality that exists within each of us. As we've explored the psychology of obedience and strategies for resistance, a deeper truth emerges. The capacity for both harmful compliance and moral courage exists within each of us. We are not simply obedient types or resistant types. We contain both possibilities, and which emerges depends largely on our awareness, preparation, and the context we create around ourselves. This duality has been recognized across cultures and throughout history. Eastern philosophies speak of yin and yang, the complementary forces within all things. Western religious traditions describe the constant struggle between our better and lesser natures. Modern psychology identifies the tension between our automatic, unconscious responses and our capacity for conscious, value-driven choice. Milgram himself recognized this duality. While his experiments are often remembered for revealing humanity's disturbing capacity for obedience, they also showed remarkable examples of resistance. Some participants, despite intense pressure, firmly refused to continue. One memorable participant, a professor of Old Testament, cited the biblical commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," and walked out of the experiment. Others insisted they couldn't continue in good conscience, regardless of the consequences to the experiment. These resistors weren't superhuman or uniquely virtuous. They were ordinary people who, in that particular moment, accessed the part of themselves capable of moral courage. The same potential exists in all of us. Understanding this duality leads to a profound shift in how we approach moral challenges. Rather than asking, "Am I the kind of person who would obey harmful orders?" a question about fixed identity, we can ask, "How can I nurture the part of myself that would resist?" a question about growth and development. This shift from identity to practice is tremendously liberating. It means that even if you've complied with questionable directives in the past, that doesn't define who you are or what you're capable of in the future. Moral courage, like any other human capacity, can be developed through intentional practice. Think of it like physical fitness. Some people may have genetic advantages that make certain physical achievements easier, but anyone can improve their strength, endurance, and flexibility through regular training. Similarly, moral courage may come more naturally to some, but everyone can strengthen this capacity through consistent practice. This practice begins with self-awareness. Learn to recognize your own responses to authority. The physical sensations, emotional reactions, and thought patterns that arise when someone in a position of power makes a request. Does your heart rate increase? Do you feel a sense of pressure or obligation? Do thoughts like, "I have no choice," or "It's not my place to question," automatically arise? These awareness moments are opportunities to pause and choose your response rather than reacting automatically. Next, practice small acts of appropriate questioning and boundary setting in everyday situations. When a friend pressures you to do something you're uncomfortable with, practice saying, "I'd rather not." When a family member makes an unreasonable demand, practice suggesting an alternative. When a boss assigns a deadline that seems impossible, practice asking for clarification or adjustments. These seemingly minor moments build the muscles of moral agency that you'll need in more significant situations. Developing empathy is another essential practice. Milgram found that participants who could vividly imagine the learner's suffering were more likely to resist harmful commands. Make a habit of considering how your actions might affect others, especially those with less power than you. This empathic imagination creates a counterweight to the agentic state, reminding you that your actions have real consequences for real people. Perhaps most importantly, create environments that support moral courage rather than blind obedience. This means surrounding yourself with people who value ethical questioning, working in organizations that reward integrity rather than just compliance, and creating family cultures where respectful discussion of rules and expectations is encouraged. When you're in a leadership position, Be especially careful about how you use your authority. Create systems where questioning is welcomed rather than punished. Make it explicit that everyone has not just the right, but the responsibility to raise ethical concerns. Recognize and reward those who appropriately question directives that could cause harm. Remember that moral courage, like physical courage, is contagious. When one person stands up, others are more likely to follow. By developing and expressing your own capacity for ethical resistance, you create ripple effects that influence those around you. You become part of the solution to the problems we've been discussing. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration, we arrive at what may be the most powerful insight of all, one that transforms how we understand both the problem of harmful obedience and our own potential for moral agency. As we've journeyed through the psychology of authority and obedience, we've uncovered disturbing truths about human nature, but also powerful insights that can transform how we live. Now we arrive at what may be the most crucial understanding of all, the power of conscious choice. The most dangerous myth about harmful obedience is that it happens to people who are weak or evil or fundamentally different from you and me. The truth revealed by Milgram and decades of subsequent research is far more challenging. Harmful obedience happens through a series of small, often unconscious choices that gradually lead people away from their own moral centers. And this means that resistance also happens through choices, conscious, intentional ones. Every time an authority figure makes a request or gives an order, you stand at a decision point. You can respond automatically, based on ingrained habits of compliance and the psychological mechanisms we've explored, or you can pause, even if just for a moment, and make a conscious choice based on your values and an assessment of potential consequences. This pause, this moment of awareness between stimulus and response, is where your freedom lies, and it's available to you in every interaction, no matter how seemingly insignificant. Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps and went on to develop logotherapy, expressed this profound truth when he wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." The space Frankl described might be only seconds long, but it's enough to interrupt automatic patterns of obedience and create the possibility of a different choice. Learning to recognize and use this space is perhaps the most powerful skill you can develop. What makes this insight so transformative is that it shifts the focus from external circumstances, which we often can't control, to internal awareness, which we can cultivate. You may not be able to change the authority structures in your workplace, community, or society overnight, but you can, starting right now, begin developing your capacity to pause, reflect, and choose, rather than simply react. This practice of conscious choice becomes particularly powerful when combined with another key insight, that what seems like a single overwhelming decision, should I obey this harmful order, can often be broken down into a series of smaller choices. Before you reach the point of having to make a dramatic stand, there are usually multiple opportunities for small acts of questioning or resistance that can shift the trajectory of events. Research on ethical decision-making shows that people often frame moral challenges as all-or-nothing situations, total compliance or dramatic rebellion. This framing makes resistance seem more costly and risky than it needs to be. In reality, there's usually a spectrum of possible responses, from asking clarifying questions to suggesting alternatives to seeking consultation to partial compliance with modifications. By recognizing these intermediate options, you expand your range of possible actions and make resistance more manageable. You don't have to be a dramatic hero willing to sacrifice everything for your principles. You can be an everyday ethical agent, consistently making small choices that align with your values and help prevent harm. Another empowering aspect of this conscious choice perspective is that it's available to everyone, regardless of personality, position, or past behavior. You don't need special traits or extraordinary courage to create a pause between stimulus and response. Anyone can learn to notice authority triggers and create this space for choice. And with practice, this capacity grows stronger. Each time you successfully pause and make a conscious choice rather than automatically complying, you strengthen neural pathways that make this response more accessible in the future. What starts as a difficult, deliberate practice gradually becomes more natural and instinct.